And we needed to rebuild our society from this great crisis, and so we had to call on everybody according to their ability to pay. And so we went to the corporations because they have a lot of ability. Someone referred earlier to the $2.5 trillion roughly that they're sitting on. Yes, they got it. So we went to them and we took it, a large portion of it, and they agreed with it. Well, let's be careful. Half of them, the half that Roosevelt split to go along with all of this, the other half didn't like it. And as soon as the war was over, the other half began to work real hard to undo the New Deal. That was the general name for all that had been done in the 30s. And as the time passed, as the Great Depression and the war receded in our memories, the business community that never wanted those things decided it didn't need to have them anymore. So the taxes on corporations went down the way I just told you. And the taxes on the rich individuals went down the way I just told you. And the government, instead of being seen as the rescuer of a failed private capitalism, was seen as the problem oppressing a private capitalism. And so here we are. All of the reforms, just about, of the Great Depression, undone in the 40 or 50 years since. They're right now in Washington writing the epitaph of Social Security. They're dissolving it as we speak. One of the great hallmarks of reform in the 1930s was a law called the Banking Act of 1933, otherwise known by the names of the two congresspersons who put it together, Glass and Stegall. It prevented banks from using their depositors' money to make investments. It split banks into depository banks and investment bank. Investment bank, Goldman Sachs, things like that. But they went to work to undo that, and they did it. In the 1990s, they finally repealed that, and our great President Clinton signed it into law. And 8 years later, the same financial collapse happened that led to that law being passed in the middle of it. You have to shake your head in stunned disbelief if you haven't heard this story. And there are now, even more amazingly, there are now amongst us, maybe even in the room here, those who imagine that what we need to do about the crisis today is to regulate these banks and to regulate these Stop. We've been there. We've done that. That doesn't work. All that does is condemn us to watch while whatever we struggled enormously to achieve in the way of reforms is undone. There was a debate in the 1930s between reformers, the ones who did all these things, Social Security, the Glass-Steagall Act, all the rest of it, and a few, very few others, who called themselves revolutionaries, who said, no, not just these little reforms, this is not going to work. They didn't say it very persuasively, and there weren't enough of them. So they were defeated. And in the end, everybody did what Roosevelt figured out. They swung in behind him. The unions did, the socialists did, the communists did too. Whatever the rhetoric, that's what they did. They celebrated him. Today, by the way, the official position of the Communist Party, the little one that's still left in the United States, is to endorse Obama. So there's nothing new in that way. But the argument between reform and revolution of the 1930s has now been settled. The reformers were wrong, and the revolutionaries were right. It's not a question of, I'm not asking you to agree with this, but the revolutionaries said, this system will undo these reforms, which is what we have. That's what we have now. Every president, starting with Roosevelt, has made the following statement, including Obama. The measures I am proposing today to get us out of this crisis of our economy will not only get us out of this crisis, but, pregnant pause, but make sure we do not have this kind of economic crisis in the future. By that standard, every president is a liar. Every president has failed. Now, I don't believe that's because the president's at fault. You don't change the system, you get the way this system works. If there's a lesson here, It's the lesson that may be scary, but the alternative is childish. We have a system that doesn't work. It doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work here. It doesn't work in Europe. You can watch it. It doesn't work. It has now polarized the society into rich and poor, and therefore it does not make the basic recognition possible. You can't have 1% doing terribly well and 99% not, because it takes 10 minutes to show you that the well-being of the 1% depends on the other 99%. And therefore, if you screw the 99%, in the end, that's what you're going to do to the 1%. And here's the proof. When this crisis hit, particularly in the middle of 2008 and into March and April of 2009, a period of time when, I can assure you, at meetings just a few miles from here in Wall Street, some of which I attended, being the NASDAQ professor, there was widespread belief that the American economic system was going to stop. And by the way, stop. Not have a difficult stop. That means there would be no trains running. There would be a problem with food delivery into the city of New York, about which there were officials from the Bloomberg administration giving advice about how that would be handled. Just so you understand how serious it was. In the autumn of 2008. Between September of 2008 and March of 2009, there were large numbers of people in Wall Street who did not think we would get through this in the most dire language I had ever heard in my life, before or since. Decisions were then made to massively intervene. You have now been hearing, particularly recently, the Federal Reserve, according to Bloomberg, research forced out of them over their desire to avoid revealing it. Bloomberg went to court. Bloomberg, the news service, not the mayor. The news service went to court and forced it out. By admission of Bloomberg, $7.7 trillion flooding into the American banking system. For those of you that don't pay attention to these details, the American banking system has been a nationalized banking system since then, to this day. Our banks cannot survive, not 5 minutes, without the government support they have now. I can see from your faces. One example, just so you get a sense of it. Over the last three years, 90% of all mortgages written in the United States, 90%, are either owned by the United States government or guaranteed by them. If the United States government didn't own or guarantee 90% of mortgages, the demand for housing in the United States wouldn't be there, which means that the price of your home would be half what it is now. The banks can't function without the government, and your wealth is immediately dependent right now and has been for years. So the idea that we live in a private enterprise system is pure ideological nonsense. We have a private system on life support from the government, which pretends that's not the case because of our ideological commitments. So for the last 3 or 4 years, we have recovered our financial sector. We have pumped unbelievable amounts of money into our banks, insurance companies, large corporations, and the stock market, where they play. For the vast mass of Americans, no recovery at all. Unemployment has stayed around 9%, give or take, for 3 years. We'll have more foreclosures in 2011 than we had the previous years. The level of benefits is dropping. The real wage, if you include benefits, is dropping. Job prospects are awful. And the consensus estimate for 2012 will be that it'll be a worse economic year than this one was. So stop. This is a failed recovery system. It services the people who control our politics. Last point. Over the last 30 years, if you've understood roughly the kind of picture I've painted for you, the mass of American working people were subject to unbelievable stresses. More hours of work, disrupted family life, if not disintegrated, levels of debt they could not sustain. Of course, they withdrew from social activity. They withdrew from political activity. There's a wonderful book I like to recommend to people by a non-leftist sociology professor at Harvard named Robert Putnam. Funny title, you'll remember it. bowling alone. The withdrawal of Americans over this period. He doesn't understand economics, which is a normal condition for getting a Harvard professorship. Anyway, I used to go there, so I really do know. But he's very good about this. He really documents it in the way sociologists like to do. But I have for you the explanation. American working people withdrew because they had to try to cope individually with the end of rising wages, the way I told you. So they withdrew from politics. Politics was no more the club, the neighborhood association, the little political. No. It's all television. You know. You've lived through it. We have politics by a different. The mass of people withdrew. The mass of Americans didn't stop being Democrats and liberals and leftists the way they had been in the 30s and the 40s. They didn't stop. They didn't change their minds. They withdrew. And as they withdrew because of their life situation in a capitalism that was screwing them, those with the money, who had the money because the workers weren't getting paid anymore, rising wages, took a part of that money and didn't just pay themselves high wages and didn't just speculate in derivatives. They also went and did the only thing a smart 1% gathering wealth into its hands would ever do. And that is to make sure that the political system didn't mess around with what was going on. So they went and they purchased the best democracy money can buy. And so we're surprised. Poll after poll tells us that the majority of Americans want something, and the Congress acts like they don't. And we keep on, what is that? What is that? There's no mystery here at all. Those Congress people, I talk to them from time to time. They even have me come and testify. They explain to me, I agree with you, Rick. But if I did that, I'd be out of office in 6 weeks, 6 months. What do you want me to do? Kill myself? I have to do that, but although I'm gone. And when I'm gone, they're going to have another person in there who will do what they want. So I get nothing. You get nothing. So let's just agree, we're right, they're wrong. Too bad, go home. Which is what they do. And which basically I do too. But we have a system that is now articulated. That's why there was no agreement of that committee, the super committee, to work something out. Here's the concluding irony, and this is as true of Europe as it is of the United States. A crisis brought on by a system that doesn't work anymore. Fixed by a political elite, purchased by the same economic forces that brought us the crisis, turns out to do a surprising thing. Take care of the people who took care of them. Money to the banks and the insurance companies. Of course, they recovered the people who put them there to do that, leaving the rest of the American people to watch. But here's a little hooker that's a little fly in the ointment. When the government stepped in to bail out those who had brought us the crisis, it had to borrow a lot of money to do that. Because it's impossible politically to bail out the rich by taxing the mass of people. Then you would have had blood in the streets. They didn't do it. They borrowed it. And now they have to begin to deal with this enormous increase in debt, whether that be in Greece or in California or anywhere else. And so the question is, who's going to pay for it? And this political system built on this capitalist economy has the answer. You. You're going to pay. We're going to give you less garbage pickup. We're going to have fewer teachers and firefighters and social workers. We're going to have what in Europe is called austerity, and here we call it fiscal prudence. Sounds better. Same thing. Cut back, cut back, cut. We're going to wait. You're going to have to wait 2 years longer to get your Social Security. Think with me for a minute as an economist. We have record unemployment. We can't generate enough jobs to provide just employment for the new young people entering the labor force. What we should be doing is lowering the age of retirement so people retire, opening the space for those who need it most. Instead, the geniuses in Washington are raising the retirement age, keeping the old people in longer so that those of you that are young are screwed a little longer as well. Very smart. This is not a question of smarts. The system doesn't work. And my final thought for you, is it doesn't help anyone to pretend that the system is not broken. That does the job of those who want to keep it going for as much longer as they can drag it out. Capitalism is like that refrigerator that you've had for 40 years. And you call the repairman, and he comes and he looks at you and he sees the sadness and fear in your eye. You want to be told it's just $30 to fix that motor. You want that. Your face radiates it. And part of him wants to sell you the crappy motor knowing you'll be calling him back in 2 weeks. But he's a decent guy. So he leans across your kitchen table and says, now don't get upset. You gotta get a new refrigerator. Capitalism is a system that we should have had debates about for the last 40 years. We didn't do that as a nation. We debate our education system, good, bad, how does it need to be changed? Our transportation system. Last year, remember, we spent all this time on our health delivery system and our health. We deal with our systems and we criticize. Good thing about the United, we do that. But not on the economic system. For 50 years, taboo. You can't question capitalism. It's so crazy that in my profession of economics, most of my colleagues teach about the system produces efficiency and equilibrium. Of course it doesn't. But they need to talk like that because there was a taboo. And you know what happens to a system, an institution, that you're not allowed to criticize for 50 years? It rots. It breaks down. We couldn't. And what we're doing now, thanks to Occupy Wall Street, is we're beginning to have the debate about our system that had we been a healthy society, we would have been doing for the last 50 years. We've got a lot to catch up on, and there ain't much time. Thank you very much. I thought the most important thing I could respond to was the question from over here about the options. Partly I didn't because you were so nice to put that quotation in your program there. But to change the system means you have to take serious steps. You're not going to vote in this turkey or that one, with all due respect, and there isn't much that's due. But in any case, I know it's attractive to imagine that we can go into a voting booth, and because that takes not much time and doesn't cost much, and if we could vote for Joe instead of Mary or vice versa, and that could get the problem solved, that's very attractive. Then we can solve a problem at a very little cost. This is not of that order of magnitude. Either you understand the level of difficulty we're in as a nation, or you don't. And I can illustrate it by referring to a couple of other questions. You are exhorted to do consumption, but the American corporations have already decided, I've been at more meetings than I bore you with, the growth of the market for American corporations is not expected to be the United States again for decades. The growth of the market is in places like Asia, Latin America, parts of Europe. They're growing faster than the United States because of the conditions we're putting our working class in. Americans cannot continue to borrow. They can't even sustain the level of debt they have. Their wages are not going up. They're flat to going down, which always happens in unemployment, and so on. So there's no growth here. If you're a company looking for growth of output, you're looking elsewhere. You're spending your advertising dollars over there. You're opening up offices over there, wherever there is. The United States is going through a long period of adjustment and decline. We're going to look like all those other countries we used to think we couldn't and wouldn't ever look like. We're well on our way. That's what's happened. The corporations are making those decisions and moves based on all of that. So yes, you go out and shop, but you're shopping also at the places that are not the big money items. You're shopping at the Walmart. The rest of the world is buying, I'm exaggerating obviously, but is buying more and more Gucci. The Americans aren't. Now that's a problem. And that's going to be with us for a long time, unless we do what? Change the basic way wealth and power are distributed in the United States. And that's not going to be done by voting for one or another of these folks, because they're not relevant to any of that. They don't even talk about it. Look at them, watch them on these absurd debates. They debate everything other than what matters. and ask us to take this seriously. We don't have to. The press does in order to keep the charade going. So what would have to be done? You'd have to do something so that the story I told you about the Depression, of all the reforms and all the changes and all the taxes that were levied and how they were taken away again and how the laws were undone, you'd have to do something about that. What does that mean? Well, we have a business organization that is the problem for us, at least a central part of the problem. It's called the corporation. And let's remember how it works. A tiny group of people control the bulk of the shares. Just so you know, 1% of shareholders own roughly 60 to 70, depending on how you count, percent of the shares. So shareholding is not a distributed phenomena, it's a highly concentrated phenomena. So the major shareholders are the ones who have all the votes. What votes? Shareholders vote for who the board of directors is. The 15 to 20 people that run every corporation. Those are picked by the shareholders. The workers may live with the results of what a board of directors does. For example, closing a factory in New York and opening one in China. Or using a toxic technology that destroys your lungs in 5 years. Those decisions are made by boards of directors. 15 to 20 people selected by the major shareholders. Another group typically of 15 to 20 people. They make the decisions that affect all the workers who are employed in that enterprise and all the people in the communities living around them. Guess what? For all boards of directors and major shareholders, the reforms passed in the 1930s, Glass-Steagall Act, high taxes, all of that, those are obstacles for them. They're hired to build the company, to make it more profitable, to give it a larger market share, to have it grow. For them, regulations, rules, reforms, taxes are so many obstacles to overcome. That's what they're paid to do. And what do they use to do it? The profits, which gather in their hands, because that's where profits gather. They gather as revenue to boards of directors. So to say this in abstract terms, but to summarize, a corporation has the incentive to undo reforms. And it has the resources to realize those incentives. It is stupid to reenact reforms, leaving in place the institutions we know must and will and have the resources to undo them. We've just been through that. If we do another set of reforms, it'll only go faster this time because they have the experience of the last 40 years to work with. It's crazy. So the solution, I would urge for people, change the organization of our enterprises. We have to do that. And the proposal for workers to become their own board of directors, to thereby socialize the enterprise, is the logical way to accomplish this. You know, and people have understood that for hundreds of years, the concept of the co-op. That's what that is. It may not get to this point because they haven't thought it through enough in terms of modern capitalism's crisis. But it's an old idea. And for those of you who take seriously, as I know most of you do from the things you've said, the concept of democracy, the corporation should be an embarrassment for you from the beginning anyway. Think about it. As an adult, you work 5 out of 7 days a week at a job, most of you for a corporation. It's the major thing you do in your adult life. If democracy means anything, it's got to be there. That's where you are as an adult. Democracy in the enterprise means those, like the old idea, those who live with the consequences of a decision ought to have the right to participate in making it. Otherwise, you don't have a democracy. But major shareholders and boards of directors, a tiny minority, have all the power. They decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. Those are all the basic decisions. So if you're a Democrat with a small d, you should have wanted this anyway. But now I'm pointing out that by not democratizing enterprises, you're leaving in place an institution designed and provided with the resources to undo the kind of economic society we want and need to avoid the crises we're suffering from. This is craziness. And only a society that has this kind of political leadership, and unfortunately so much of this ideological leadership in our culture, makes us unable to confront what we kind of already know. If you didn't already know what I said today, you wouldn't have found it as edifying as you did. So it's not me. I've been saying these things for 40 years. But in the last, as I told you at the beginning, the last 2 years, I can't handle the flood of invitations. And they're not just from folks like you, who are already 3/4 of the way there. My biggest radio program that I do regularly is in Salt Lake City, a commercial AM station in which the man who invites me begins his program by saying proudly, I am a Republican and I am a Mormon. But you got to hear this Professor Richard Wolff. And then over the next hour, he and I agree on almost everything. The United States is not the society that the newspapers and the TV present to you. That is not the case. It is no more the case about our economic system than it is about the political attitudes of our people. The thing that surprised everybody is that Occupy Wall Street, in poll after poll, had a majority of Americans sympathizing with what they said. That is the strength we have to now mobilize. But it's already there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much.